The following episode is a special 6-part series that was recorded in March 2020.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and anybody that's listening. We're here in Geneva, IATA headquarters, and we've got a young gentleman, somebody that I've got an awful lot of respect for, known him a long time, like him ever so much. The gentleman's name is Brendan Sullivan. So, Brendan, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. And for anybody who's able to see Brendan, there's no need for concern. It's not a Guy Ritchie Sherlock film that's coming out. He's one of the most extravagant dressers in the industry and one of the probably one of the best dressed men in the business. Now, Brendan, Head of Commerce and Cargo Ops, which you've been for the last 6 years, and you've been in the industry for 20 years. So I would imagine, I can't remember, when was the first time we met?
Would have been at one of the first COAG meetings, probably about 10 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, something around that.
Yeah, the very first one, huh?
Yeah.
First official one. Right, let's start there, and let's allow you to introduce yourself, what you were doing, but also how and why COAG started, what it was, and how it's now developed into the ICHC.
Sure. Yeah.
So where you go?
So it's officially Brendan Sullivan, no O. I don't know when we dropped the O, but
I just have to put the O in because every time I see you I go, oh. It's always a surprise, Brendan.
Thank you. Like you said, so I've been in this role for about 6 years now. I've been with IATA for 12, 13.
Yeah.
Before that I was with Air Canada. Started in March this very month, 20 years ago. And it just goes by really, really quickly. To go on to COAG specifically, I was actually in the role of the Dangerous Goods standards at the time, and the head of cargo was Des Vertanes. Des, along with the cargo committee, so the heads of cargo at all the airlines, recognized that there was a need to have more dialogue with the ground handlers, airline ground handler dialogue. And to then provide them advice. COAG was the Cargo Operational Advisory group. And so it started from that. It started from the need to have more dialogue on cargo and on operational matters, because those things tend to fall to the wayside.
Yeah.
The evolution, that group was extremely successful and produced the first drafts of the cargo handling manual. We put it into IGOM initially, and then it grew to the point where it couldn't just be an IGOM. It needed to be its own thing. It needed to be something that ground handlers had in their operation regularly. It's just one example of success that they had, and we needed more. We needed more engagement on the standards side, and we needed more advice and more dialogue. So we created the ICHC, a consultative council between airlines and ground handlers. And it's half-half. It's 8 airlines, 8 ground handlers, all senior, all really respected in the industry. They come together, they debate the issue at hand, and we come up with the best solution, which I think is their key. They don't come up with the thing everyone could manage. They come up with the thing everyone absolutely has to do, the best version of the solution. It's not a lowest common denominator type of approach, which is great, because sometimes that can be the easy path is to go to the lowest common denominator, and then you don't necessarily end up with the benefits that you were hoping to achieve when you set out.
Yeah, and I must say, I started off as one of the original members of the COAG and still with the ICHC, and I've got to say, on a personal note, I've met some exceptional colleagues in the industry, people who care passionately, they've got great experience, and like you said, they go for what's the right thing to do, not the easy or the most common thing to do, and I think, long may it stand. I think it's probably one of the most successful committees in the IATA family, I would have suggested.
Certainly, yeah. We've got a few that are really successful, put out great standards and regulations. This one has the added component of that kind of dialogue part of their mandate that I think is unique in the cargo world, which I think is absolutely required, and they've been extremely successful at.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. And anybody that's been a member on it or on there at the moment, they should be very proud of what they're doing. A great group. Yeah. Good, right, so now, the ICHM itself, how successful do you think it's been?
It's been really successful, actually. If you look at how many, for example, how many copies are out in the industry.
How many are out there now?
We're looking at thousands now. And I don't remember the exact number, but the other thing that we've done is there have been partners of ours, I'll mention one by name, for example, Menzies Aviation, Menzies Cargo. So they've actually put it into that's the baseline for all of their operating procedures.
It's good.
While they may not have thousands of copies throughout the Menzies environment, every single person operating related to cargo has the ICHM as their baseline. So as a standard, it's been extremely well respected, and it's getting more and more implementation. We've run a number of different workshops throughout the world. I just came back from Africa, where we had nearly 250 individual participants, all who now have a better understanding of the ICHM, how it works, and how to implement it. I think that's the key piece, because it's a set of work instructions, right? It's not a high-level policy manual. It's really, this is how you should operate, and therefore how to implement that, how to replace what you had before, and how to minimize the duplication in the airline world with many airlines producing very similar-looking manuals. That's the key piece to this. So it does take a little bit longer, perhaps, than some other manuals, but I think we've grown 400% since we started, since the second edition. So since we had some,
that's right, yeah.
Which is really quite impressive, actually.
No, it's good, and I've got to say I push it all the time, because I see it as a steering catalyst, and also to start using it against carriers who want to have their own manuals and make things so complex, which is what we should all be trying to avoid. I think it's fantastic, and the link with the MOP with regards to the messaging and everything, it's great when you start to show people how one references the other. I think it's an exceptional.
Yeah. And in addition to just linking to the master operating plan, we've also linked it to the mail master operating plan. And that means you can start to bring your mail and cargo processes a little bit closer together, start to align the systems. It's that kind of efficiency that the airline handling environment absolutely requires. I just think it's been a really successful manual. There's a little bit more to go. We need more airlines to do the gap analysis. It's a tool that we provide within the manual. So you do a gap analysis, you figure out where your issues are, where you're different somehow, and work to close those gaps, whatever they may be. That could be actually coming back to the ICHC and saying these things should change, and we welcome that. There are new ways of operating that need to be explored all the time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And mentioning cargo and mail, when we start talking about e-commerce a little bit later on, we'll come back to that, because maybe there's some space for that particular conundrum within issue 5. Now, moving on from ICHM, another tool that is smart, and smart by name, smart by practice, the smart facility. I think that's also a great tool, but it's one that people aren't really aware of yet, much as they should be anyhow.
Sure. Yeah.
So do you want to just explain a little bit about what the smart facility is, why it was put together?
Sure. So it started quite a while ago, and maybe that's why it's grown quite organically. We didn't want to come out with something that day one just was a full-blown idea coming from one side of the industry or another. We wanted to identify operational capacity throughout the industry. It's very difficult for anyone, any customer in air cargo, shipper, freight forwarder, airline, ground handler, to understand what the actual capacity of another player is. What are they capable of doing, and to what standard do they actually do this? And so from that came this smart facility operational capacity concept. We have a few different pillars to this. There's the audit itself, the operational capacity audit. There's the ARC, what we call the ARC, the audit reduction commitment. There's the one source platform where all of this information ends up. So we start with the operational capacity audit, and there it's going to actually reduce how many repetitive audits come from airlines to their ground handling partners.
And do you think that'll be reality, Brendan? Seriously?
We absolutely do.
How many carriers have signed up or made a commitment to that?
We have one signature to the ARC right now. We have a number who are in the middle of their gap analysis because the requirement for the ARC is that they actually identify the percentage they will reduce their audit scope by. So we're not asking airlines not to audit. We recognize that there are safety and security provisions that they must audit. We also recognize that they really should focus on those things which make their airline and their airline products unique. That they should be able to audit that. So they have to do a gap analysis and then identify what their reduction potential is, and then they commit to it and they sign it. So we've got a number who are in that process.
So do you think it makes sense for carriers to sort of prioritise or do categories of stations that they're having handled by partners? So you've got critical, important, recommended, and you then audit them differently?
Absolutely. You, as a carrier, you have a risk profile, and that's based on where you fly and who your partners are in those places that you fly. And really, in the end, who your customers are. So who is putting cargo onto your aircraft? How well do you know them? What's the extension of that reach? And so understanding that and having the right measures and controls in place, sometimes they're extremely robust. You don't need to audit as frequently.
Yeah.
In other cases, there's maybe some gaps, and that's where you want to spend your effort. And that's exactly what this does. It allows the airline then to go in and focus in those locations where they have safety issues and not repeat the same operational audit. Usually that reduction is 50 to 80%. That's what we've seen so far in all the gap analysis, at least 50 and sometimes all the way up to 80%. And so we are prioritizing the audit reduction commitment first, getting the airlines to do the gap analysis and commit to reducing their audit scope. And second will come these operational capacity audits. They come because the ground handlers actually want to see what their operational capacity is to all of these standards, because it's not just one, right? It's the ICHM and all of the relevant pieces.
Yeah.
It's their equipment, it's their infrastructure, and how they operate it.
And also different markets, because you can have technology against cheaper labour and they can still be as efficient.
They absolutely
or still
can.
pass certain criteria.
And the last piece that I mentioned is one source, and one source is where all of this information will reside, and our customer can then look at it and see in detail whether they've deployed technology to solve this problem or whether they've perhaps taken another approach. It will all be visible what their equipment and infrastructure and operational capacity actually are. It's those sort of elements that we feel will be the successful factor here.
Yeah. So let me ask something now. And I've spent a bit of time with an old colleague, Dave Ambridge, of late. Okay, and I'm trying to get him onto the podcast in an unplugged version that would only go out after 9 o'clock.
Okay.
But one of the things that he always used to say, and I admire him for being so outspoken, he always said, and if you take the whole chain, you've got one party who pushes their business upstream. So they know where it's got to go, when it's got to be there, or what or when they'd like it to be there. Mm-hmm. But they don't really take too much effort or interest in what happens once it goes then to the forwarder. Mm-hmm. Then the forwarder chooses a carrier. Then the carrier chooses a handling agent. Mm-hmm. Then the handling agent does what they can or can't do within the amount of money that's been allocated for the service that they have to provide. Yeah. So in essence, there's a dumbing down of all the criteria from that very beginning. Mm. So if the understanding and the knowledge went back to the origin status, and then they had more influence in demanding what they wanted on the whole process, then the directory or whatever has to choose, right, I want this, whether it's farm or whether it's whatever it is, which means I expect this, I must have this is nice to have, etc. It makes the choice then of the carrier and the carrier of the GHA a little bit more relevant, and then it helps the health check of the whole supply chain.
It does, yeah.
Now, in principle, if that worked, it'd be good. So if that's one of the objectives of this exercise, that the shippers become more aware of what the capabilities are and how they should be the ones who are influencing what goes on, that makes more sense.
It's a key component. In the end, the shipper's the one who injects cargo into the supply chain. And so without understanding what their levels of service actually are, I don't know that the supply chain will ever truly deliver on what they're asking for. It's not made any easier with e-commerce, where you've got the buyer, the purchaser of the e-commerce, acting as that person injecting levels of service into the supply chain. As a frequent online shopper myself, so
I can see, Brendan.
I'm the one.
And you certainly mix and match, yeah?
Yes, I do. I'm the one who says whether I want it next day or 3 days, and whether I want it to come by a certain method or mode. And that requirement needs to be translated through products and services throughout the supply chain. And it's not done one-to-one. I mean, there are millions and millions of e-commerce shoppers, and not millions and millions of variations of product. It's certainly not what we're trying to go for. So creating the awareness of what is capable throughout the supply chain allows shippers, freight forwarders, and airlines to choose more effectively, to choose the right partners for the right types of cargo, to build longer term relationships, because it's absolutely key.
Yeah.
And then to be able to upskill, right, and add operational capacity to whoever those parties actually are.
Right. Well, we've got clear definition between what I would term as e-commerce and traditional cargo, and then you've got specialist cargo as well, or specialised product cargo.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm saying is there a worthwhile opportunity for yourselves or anybody to start lobbying directly to the shippers to influence the quality and the expectation and the standards that they should be demanding as part of their tenders to forwarders, etc., so that there's more influence from that point? Because when it gets to the ends, and as you know, in any walk of life, things can go wrong. Mm-hmm. So if cargo is damaged or missing, or it's not declared properly, etc., that then causes another set of problems. Whereas if it had been directed and as transparent as possible from the beginning, mm-hmm. it would make those choices a lot easier.
Yeah.
And hopefully, it would also inject a little bit more realistic pricing into the whole supply chain.
So there's an opportunity to have more discussions with shippers. We certainly speak to them quite frequently. We run every 2 years we run a shipper survey. There's now an e-commerce component of the shipper survey. We go to IATA as a whole, IATA Cargo, go to a number of shipper events where we try and discuss with them and get a sense of what it is that they truly want and therefore what might be missing, and to invite them to have that dialogue more directly. Yeah. Our core focus will always be the airline side of the equation and bringing in all of those different partners. And so with that in mind, there's opportunity to do more, and I think there are more shippers becoming more willing to have those discussions and to be more clear. As we see with things like in our digital cargo space, One Record, there are more shippers who are willing to share information in order to get ultimately service, that service that they're looking for. Yeah. And that's not necessarily, I mean, we say better, but it's the right service for the cargo that they wish to move. So you mentioned e-commerce. E-commerce is any type of cargo. Yeah. Might also move by mail. And then you've got regular cargo, and regular cargo can be must ride, next flight, or it can be just any time within the next few days because we just want it to be there. You've got then specialized high value verticals or whatever the airline wishes to call them. So your pharmaceuticals, your live animals, and many other specialty cargoes, and they're all different. They all have different needs. And so getting that to be standardized is one of the challenges of these groups, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. But like I said, I think it's worthwhile because obviously the traditional relationship is carrier forwarder. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you've got a separate relationship, which is the shipper and the forwarder.
Yeah.
But the party that probably has developed into the washing machine of the whole process, which is the ground handling agent, is sometimes either overlooked, neglected, or some of the ground handling agents would say influenced or even abused. Mm-hmm. And yet the functionality that they have to carry out now is so much more important than probably it was several years ago. Yeah. So how do you see that? How do you see that entire group or family or chain linking together to actually come up with what's necessary for the entire supply chain?
Well, that's essentially where ICHC and the dialogue that goes well beyond just those 16 members that's where its value is, right? The ground handler has 70% or more of the operation. these days. So they're
It does,
really,
but they're, sorry to interrupt you, it does, but as they would all say, the boogeyman in the cupboard for them is Mr. Procurement.
yes,
And their fear is that irrespective of what's expected and what's demanded, is the price,
yeah,
that terrible term
yeah.
affects what they can and can't do.
Yeah, and that's where I say that these types of groups are where it's critical, because so the standard ground handling agreement, the service level agreement, they've been misused over the years.
Yes.
And they're fantastic documents when used correctly.
Yes.
They help standardize all manner of practices. However, if you add to your SLA a bunch of things which can never be measured, then they won't be measured, and the service quality will drop.
It's
So
only
that
used then
dialogue
for when something goes wrong.
Correct. And so that dialogue, that place to meet is airlines and ground handlers, for sure.
Yeah.
And we need to bring into those discussions customer requirements, because they can't disappear from the dialogue.
Yeah. Now, one of the good things that, and in all the years we've been working together as well, Brendan, is I'm always trying to tell people, be a little bit stronger. You can't keep being pushed back all the time. At one point, you've got to stop. And the simplified SLA that's in the ICHM, that makes full sense, okay? Because if you, like you said, if you can't measure it or don't want to measure it, what's the point?
Yeah.
But equally, if the ground handling agent tries to stick to the best IATA tools, it's a great argument for them to have consistency, because you've got to think of the staff.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got employees down on the floor, and then they have to put their hand on their head for one carrier, their finger in their ear for another, they have to hold their nose for another. It's very difficult to have some sort of standard.
Yeah.
And what I try and explain to the ground handlers is, just do your own standard that meets everything that you are expected to meet. And then if the carrier is happy to get that level, well enough. If they want something above it, then it's up to you and the carrier to decide what happens with that. But just try and keep something consistent. I mean, that's something you'd advocate?
Without a doubt. I mean, that's essentially where all of our standards come in. So they're not bottom standard, lowest common denominator standards.
Yeah.
They're higher level. If you can operate to the ICHM, you're going to cover 80% of what the airlines require. In fact, we did that analysis before even building the ICHM, was to look at all the airline procedures. And go line by line and find out where we matched, and that's how we came up with that manual. And if you add to that programs like Smart Facility Operational Capacity and these other things, you make it much more clear what it is that you operate to. And then airlines, of course, can come in and request other things that match their unique products. And that's great, because what we've heard from every single ground handler out there is, if you let me do the standard thing standard, I will be in a position to offer as much flexibility as you want on all these other areas. If forced to operate differently for every single carrier that they handle, they will struggle and fail and make mistakes and end up having to focus back on their core, which is operating safely to get that cargo correctly onto the airline's aircraft.
As much as they can do.
To the extent humanly possible. Yeah.
Exactly. No, I totally agree, and I just think the ICHM as well. It's almost like a storybook, because you start at the beginning, and then you all the way to the consignee, and it covers everything in between.
Yeah.
And it's a great training tool as well.
Yeah.
So I also use it to show people when they're coming in. If you take this and look at the main chapters, you've got the whole storyline of anything that you're going to be doing in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
So it works exceptionally well.
Yeah.
Now moving on. Okay, now we've got e-commerce, which is something you love, and obviously I would imagine here's something. All the people who order e-commerce and the return rates. What's your thoughts on the return rates and what it's doing to the business, what it's doing to everything, even the environment?
Yeah. So I think that's where I would focus the return rate on, is the sustainability and environmental impacts. I don't know what the return rate is. It varies drastically from reseller to reseller. But one of the things that is really important when looking at whether or not there's going to be a return rate, there will be some, is, can we do it sustainably, right? Can we return these products sustainably? And air cargo is going to play some role there, but for the most part, these returns are less time sensitive and will move by other modes. The customer is making it very, very clear that they're more and more interested in sustainable choices. And that will include retailers making it very clear what the return looks like to make it more sustainable for the,
Yeah.
and I mean that in all facets of sustainability. But there have been some surveys that indicate, 50-60% of consumers are ready to make choices which they believe are better for the environment and for the general population. But they need to be provided with that insight, that info.
So you think that little bit of knowledge will stop people ordering 5 pairs of shoes because they're not sure what size or what colour?
I wouldn't go quite that far, Chris. A little bit of knowledge will help. It'll help people make better choices. And then we need to further that with some standards in place.
And what about rating? A little bit like credit rating. So somebody or from a particular address that has a huge return rate, do you think it will come when they are restricted in what they can and can't buy with some artificial intelligence?
I know that the e-commerce, especially the big majors, have all kinds of technology to help them detect the return rates and to help them solve certain challenges in that area, that people who are doing that for other than just normal consumer behavior. We're not going to stop consumer behavior with this.
Exactly.
So consumer behavior will continue and it'll evolve. The point that I'm trying to make is that consumers are significantly more willing to make better conscious choices around the sustainability side. And that'll change, that'll evolve, but that's the current dialogue, and it's moving more and more in that direction.
Yeah, I'm doing some work with Nakel Express and in Saudi, and I think they've got one of the lowest return rates. It's about somewhere between 10, 11 and 14%, which is exceptional. Mm-hmm. But it's something that they focus on all the time because of what it does to the business.
Sure.
But some of the people that I know as well and their personal habits, I mean, it's a huge awareness exercise, and they don't realise what the impact is of what they're doing. It's just like comfortable shopping in their home where they can try on what they want and then return what they don't, and who knows what happens to it once it goes on the return trail.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the consumer behavior is. It is what it is. It's what's given us, in many respects, the large boom in e-commerce that we've seen over the number of years. It's also what's creating, on the flip side, the need for a much more sustainable approach to that, a much better,
Yeah.
And what I will say, it definitely changes from generation to generation. There are certain generational buyers who operate very differently to others, and will buy more or less depending on how old they are, what generation they're from, and what the habits of the local social habits actually look like.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. Yeah, it's incredible. Now, on the e-commerce, okay, you mentioned earlier about cargo and mail, mm-hmm. and this hybrid phenomenon.
Yeah.
You want to explain a little bit about that and where that causes concerns?
Well, yeah, we call them hybrid scenarios. We don't really have another term for them at the moment. They're essentially where an item moves as cargo and then is transformed into mail, or the other way around.
Yeah.
And it has all kinds of complexity. So there's not just one facet to this. The fact that it moves between those two means that from an airline perspective, it moves between two different systems. Airlines typically operate one system for cargo and one system for mail.
And do you want to explain why?
Because there's a completely different messaging structure between the two, completely different customer relationship between the two, where there's this still long-standing relationship where the posts and the airlines were largely national flag carriers. That kind of feeling of relationship still resides, even though many of them have moved on, and most of them have moved on from that. So there's a very different customer dynamic between a freight forwarder and a postal operator, designated postal operator. There is also different documentation required. So I mentioned messaging, but when it's paper, it's completely different. Cargo moves under airway bills, and post moves under CN documents, under a different convention, different rules, different regulations from what we have under cargo and ICAO. And so all of these differences make it really difficult to handle these blended scenarios, to understand whether this is an acceptable blended scenario. There may be some where that are not acceptable, that they should in fact have landed in that country of transit, cleared in that country of transit, and then be re-injected into a domestic or regional supply chain. And carriers have no way of knowing. They have no visibility on that if we don't come up with a better method of handling hybrid scenarios.
Or chameleon.
Chameleon.
Which is a risk, How can it change from one set of standards on one system to another?
Yeah.
So that the question is, when is it going to stop and be more transparent?
So we're working with the UPU, the Universal Postal Union, on clarifying what actually hybrid scenarios are. Some of them are totally normal, totally acceptable, where we have people operating in the country of origin closer to what we would think of as a freight forwarder. And so they put it into the air transportation stream as cargo, and then at a country of transit, it then becomes mail because it originated from that kind of provider, and it moves in a domestic or regional mail supply chain, and that's acceptable from the UPU conventions. But it's not clear when that's the case, and so we're working on the clarity part, so define what they look like, and we're doing that with the Universal Postal Union. You may have seen that recently we signed a memorandum of understanding with the International Post Corporation, so we have lots of areas of working airline post together to provide that clarity, and to begin to be able to then focus on the issues at hand. So once we understand, once everyone understands what these scenarios actually are, we can start to tackle the issues of, are we missing something from a compliance perspective? Is there a risk that we've added, either an operational risk where we're not sure what services we're attempting to meet, or is there a safety or security risk because they are under different provisions and different schemes at the moment. So you can't tackle that until you know what it is, until everybody has a common understanding of what that is. So we start there. And then we can start to look at aligning the various systems. So we have system alignment between airline cargo and airline postal systems. We can map the messages between the two, and then we can start to look at, okay, did we have a safety risk here or not? Because in many cases it's not. In many cases this is normal cargo or normal item flow that's completely acceptable. So we need to just
and identifying where there's certain advantages.
They're not doing these scenarios because they're not advantageous. They're clearly these are things that they're
bypassing certain areas and benefiting from others.
They're finding efficient routes, right? And so finding efficient routes is part of supply chain management, and it's what they do sort of all day, every day. And e-commerce has helped contribute to that because there are capacity issues throughout the world. So now we need to look for these channels and channel appropriately. Our focus is really not on saying, that we can't do this, but on really saying these are what you can do, and this is what you should be looking for to make sure that those are the things that you can do.
And understanding why.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I agree. Now, you mentioned about whether or not there's risk or whatever. One of the big issues with e-commerce and people is whether it be ignorance or just a lack of awareness or sometimes intent. Some items are undeclared, and intentionally so. And how do we get around that?
So we've
especially dangerous goods, lithium batteries, etc.
Yeah, I mean we've got you can break that down into a few different facets. So we've got the willfully non-compliant, right? Those who purposely go out of their way not to follow the various rules and regulations. And there we really stress that the various government entities, and it's not always civil aviation authorities, it's many times departments of justice and civil areas that need to actually get involved and to stop that activity. And if there's, as an example, the production of counterfeit items, the Department of Justice will go into those countries and say you're not allowed to produce those, and they'll work to stop that activity. And we need to do that as well for lithium batteries, because the trickle-down effect is that at some point they end up in the homes.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so now you have counterfeit items that are in the homes of people, right?
Yeah.
And that's really just not acceptable. And in some cases, they may not be aware that that's the case.
Yeah.
So that's the approach there is really to educate and make sure that the government as a whole and the applicable government agencies are tackling those problems properly. We then have the non-compliant, more because they didn't quite know what the regulations were. Perhaps they were complex or confusing to get through a supply chain, and so they've found a path of low resistance. And that's where the traditional aviation really needs to focus their attention, and does, right? That's where we do acceptance checks and we catch many of these things.
But it's what happens when you catch it.
And what happens when you catch it when it's already started to move through a supply chain,
Exactly.
where it might already be in another country, and it hasn't taken an air journey yet, but it might have already moved from one country to another by road. Got multiple jurisdictions involved. I'm not suggesting it's an easy problem to solve, but it's an area where air cargo has been very good at doing acceptance and making sure that we accept the right things to move. What is missing is we don't do acceptance on mail. That's the postal operator who does it. So making sure that they're aware of what the airline wants to or is able to carry is important. I don't know if we've mentioned this very often, but there's actually a new piece of ICAO regulation that's coming into place. So there's a ICAO Annex 6, there's a Chapter 15 on cargo and mail safety. And that's really about ensuring that the airline and their various partners who move mail and cargo are aware of each other's procedures, and that they integrate that into a safety management system. So it's sort of, if you're an airline, you need to know that the freight forwarder has a similar safety management system, will do similar things for you, and you can lock those two procedures into place. And that whenever you find an issue, you have a method of going back and performing corrective action across that chain, right? Because otherwise you just have two parties performing corrective action, and really none of them ever meet in the middle when we try and do that. And it applies to both cargo and mail. So it means that the airlines need to do this as well with their designated postal operators.
But with self-assessments and verification, validation exercises.
At the ICAO level, the guidance is quite high level. The obligations on the carrier to ensure that they have the procedures in place and that their partners do. And so we've developed some recommended practices that we need to get a little bit further along to guide airlines as to what those really could look like. We've drafted some procedures airlines can put in place and start to implement them.
Okay, good. Okay, well, that's great to pick up and to point out. So that's very good. Now, again, on the lithium battery side, there's another issue now and again, people don't realise what happens when they heat up and swell and how long a lithium battery can be knocked or dropped or whatever, and how long it remains at risk. Mm-hmm. So the business now of identifying if something's happened to a shipment or an individual piece, and what the repercussions can be several hours later. What's your thoughts on that with regards to having some sort of incubation or identifying that something's happened?
Yeah.
And this brings in a just culture, because in many places, if you're the one who's actually dropped something or banged something, are you really going to report that you've done so?
We would hope so, because this is a safety item. Right. So if you drop something that you have lithium batteries or suspected lithium batteries in, we would hope that this is we're either at or very close to getting to a place where everybody's happy to report that at a no fault culture.
No for just culture.
We recognize that that's maybe not 100% in all places, but we would encourage it. Where I think we need to focus some attention is on the correct procedure in those cases. So you'll be aware of this. Actually, the ICHC is looking at exactly that. What are these right procedures so that everyone kind of can apply the same thing? One idea is to quarantine these items for some period of time. Certainly makes some sense, right? Especially with the kind of volumes and density we can regularly see in air cargo. There are probably some other ideas as well, which people like the incredibly smart people at the ICHC can help us come up with.
So are you putting the pressure on the incredibly intelligent and clever people on the ICHC?
I'm putting the pressure on the industry coming up with some solutions that benefit them. And we've come with a few ideas. We're starting to have that dialogue. I think we need these procedures in place quickly, because the risk around lithium batteries and the potential for it to catch fire slightly afterwards, after even a small incident, I think that risk is just not one that the airlines are willing to accept. And so coming up with the right procedures, making sure that ground handlers are aware that this is okay. We understand things happen in transport. That's what we talk about them when we ask shippers to build and prepare their items. That there's mechanical handling, there's vibration, there's some drop and some shock and some temperature changes. So there's an element of this is normal in the operation, and as soon as that gets a little bit too far, it's important that we declare it, say it happened, and then perform whatever this action is. And quarantining is one of them, where quarantining for a specific period, but we need to be clear about what that is, so that airlines can inform their customers as well.
No, 100%. 100%. Now, taking as well another safety alternative and how well things have developed over the years, whether it be fire covers, fire containers, etc. Where do you think that's taken us?
So we know that there are a number of different parties who have implemented either fire containment covers or fire-resistant containers, and they're quite good. They operate quite well. They provide a extra level of safety when you have a fire risk. There are some difficult considerations for these parties to make when they want to implement them. So if you use, for example, covers, what do you put the cover on?
Exactly.
Is it on the ones where you know there are lithium batteries, or the ones where you don't know there are lithium batteries? So that's difficult. And then there's, of course, mechanical handling and operational procedures to return the relatively heavy and reusable items. So those are a lot of considerations, but probably the biggest one that I think has led to us not having mass adoption of this is the lack of a lithium battery fire standard. So what does a lithium battery look like? How long does it burn? What does it do? And that's a really complex question to answer. And so without standards in that area, so aviation standards from the governments and ICAO, it's very difficult for these fire resistant and fire containment elements to adequately be described as performing the benefit that they were stated to. So they might actually do that already. They might need small changes, but it's very difficult for someone who makes these to actually say this is what it does and this is how long it does it for, because they can't point to a standard to do that. Or they can only point to certain standards which are normal fire standards. So that's a really key area. We know of a number of carriers who have done tons of research on their own and come up with their approaches that have given them a level of safety that makes them more comfortable to operate. And it changes, right? Where you operate from, who you operate with, your risk profile changes. And that'll change what kind of protective measures you need to put in place.
Yeah, huge area of opportunity there as well. And obviously, then you have to battle between the cost of it and the benefit,
and the operational complexity to manage it. Right? In all cases, so ULDs, we know that the industry doesn't treat ULDs as well as they should. They're expensive assets.
Don't be just.
And from the smart facility operational capacity side, I don't know that there's ever been a single audit where we haven't seen at least one ULD on the ground for some period of time.
And one is,
and it's just one, right? But one means there's probably multiple.
Multiples, yeah.
And the fire-resistant containers are going to be treated in a similar fashion, and so these are important discussions.
Eventually we'll have a smart container that says I've just been smashed or bashed or misused, and I'm in the wrong area, and we need that sort of intelligence now.
It's happening now. The amount of innovation in the ULD space right now is incredible. More devices looking at tracking where they are. You have an idea of what the handling environment looks like, and you can just add more and more device sensors to it, more data.
I mean, the more challenges, the more excitement in the business, and it's a great industry. Now, just before we wrap up, what would you say have been the three biggest, most positive things that have happened since you've been in the position you're in?
Since I've been in the position that I'm in, we released the first cargo handling manual. So that's the first set of operational handling standards available to airlines and ground handlers on the cargo side. And even today, we still get comments that there aren't handling standards for the industry to follow, and there are now. They're in their 4th edition, and they're getting better and better every year. We'll start to add safety risk assessments in the coming years
good.
To guide people how to even implement these things further. So that one was absolutely key. I think it creates a platform on which we can have all kinds of efficiency, safety, and other discussions that we couldn't have had before.
Yep.
And then the other one would be smart facility, right? Smart facility, the operational capacity audit, the fact that we've now moved this over to one source as well. It's been a discussion that we've been having for a long time. The industry needs to know what the capabilities are throughout the industry, and we need to reduce redundant audits. And so that combination of these solutions is absolutely critical.
Also, sorry to interrupt you there, Brendan, the one with a smart facility, that also should put a little bit more pressure on airports as well, to make sure that everything that happens in that airport markets the airport against other airports. So they should also take a vested interest in it. Are you seeing that?
We're seeing some share some interest, and it'll be very interesting, because the day you look at the one source and look in a particular location, you'll actually start to see all the operational capacity that is there, and airports will be keen to make sure that that's accurate, that it reflects the reality, and to improve that through investments that in some cases belong to the airport to make.
Yeah, and also with cargo now, I mean, obviously we're in very troubled times at the moment, but in general terms, with cargo representing a decent percentage of an airline's revenue, and also being a bit more of a positive business venture, it's going to be more important for airports now to market themselves above others.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go back, so the last thing is not something that we've necessarily done by ourselves, but ever since I got into this position and just slightly before, we started to see just this massive increase in airline ground handler dialogue at a completely different level. In my previous job, I had seen a lot of it on a bilateral basis, and it kind of stayed there. And now we see that happening much more in this sort of multilateral environment. People can learn from others' experience. We can set the appropriate standards when there are standards that need to be set, or that dialogue can just happen in the way that this industry really needs. You know, if the airlines are going to contract out 70% of their cargo handling operation, we're going to need to have ongoing dialogue with the ground handlers.
Most definitely,
and that's improved. It's not just at IATA, but I say that's improved for the industry as a whole in the last 6, 7, 8 years. It's only gotten better. We haven't seen sort of a retraction from that, which gives me hope that when we do get into difficult times, we can still focus on having that engagement.
Yeah, and working closer together. Brendan, thanks very much. On a personal note, I've known you since you used to blush, and what you've done has been tremendous. Seriously, I've got so much respect for you, and I've learned an awful lot from you, and I really enjoyed the early days in COAG and many of the conferences, and long may it continue. You're doing a great job, my friend.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your time. Okay, and look forward to seeing more improvements, more changes, more dialogue in the future.
Awesome.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.